Welcome back to Inheritance of Evil, the channel where we explore the dark side of dynastic wealth and the unspeakable things people will do to possess it. Old money has a saying, the first generation makes it, the second generation spends it, and the third generation ruins it. But sometimes the ruin is not financial. Sometimes it's a ruin of the soul. Tonight's story takes us behind the ivy-covered walls of the Sterling family estate, a place where blood is thinner than ink on a legal document. We will witness a sibling rivalry that escalates from petty jealousy to calculated, cold-blooded murder. It is a cautionary tale about how the corrosive power of greed can dissolve the most sacred of family bonds. Before we open the last will and testament of the Sterling family, if you find yourself fascinated by the intricate webs of deception that money can weave, make sure you subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell. You won't want to be left out of the inheritance. Now, the family has gathered in the library. The lawyer is about to speak, and a killer is sitting amongst them, feigning grief. The Sterling family estate, known as Greywood, was not a home. It was a dynasty cast in stone and mortar. Nestled in the rolling, emerald hills of upstate New York, the sprawling Tudor mansion was a monument to the immense fortune amassed by the patriarch, Alistair Sterling, a man who had built a global shipping empire from nothing but grit and ruthless ambition. Alistair had ruled his family with the same iron fist he used to rule his boardroom. He was a king, and Greywood was his castle. His death, at the age of 92, was not a tragedy. It was a power vacuum. It left behind two heirs, his only children, who were less like siblings and more like rival claimants to a throne. Julian Sterling was the elder, a quiet, scholarly man of 45 with his father's height but none of his fire. He was a history professor at a small, prestigious college, a man who found more comfort in dusty tomes than in balance sheets. He had always been a disappointment to his father, who saw his academic pursuits as a weak, effeminate evasion of his dynastic duty. Julian lived a modest life, worlds away from the opulence of Greywood, and seemed to have made a quiet peace with being the forgotten prince. His younger sister, Serafina, was the opposite. At 38, she was a flawless, polished diamond of a woman, with her father's ambition and a beauty that was both a weapon and a shield. She had never left the orbit of Greywood. She had embraced her role as the Sterling heiress with a single-minded devotion, managing the family's charitable foundations and social calendar with a ruthless efficiency. She had been her father's favorite, the child who mirrored his own drive and hunger. She saw Greywood not as a home, but as her birthright. On the day of the funeral, a cold, slate-gray November afternoon, Greywood was a stage for a somber, well-heeled drama. After the service, the family and a few close advisors gathered in the cavernous, oak-paneled library for the reading of the will. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows on the faces of the two siblings, who sat on opposite ends of a long leather sofa, a chasm of unspoken resentment between them. The family lawyer, a portly, oldish man named Arthur Covington, cleared his throat and broke the seal on a thick vellum envelope. "This," he announced with practiced solemnity, "is the last will and testament of Alistair Sterling, executed 1 month ago." Serafina sat forward slightly, a flicker of triumphant anticipation in her cool, blue eyes. She had been at her father's side constantly during his final months, managing his care, his affairs, his very existence. She knew, with absolute certainty, that his final act would be to reward her loyalty. Covington began to read. There were bequests to loyal staff, donations to universities and museums, the usual philanthropic gestures of the obscenely wealthy. Then he came to the heart of the matter. "To my daughter Serafina," he read, "for her years of devotion, I leave the Sterling Family Foundation with an endowment of $100 million to manage as she sees fit. I also leave her the entirety of my art collection and the contents of the New York City penthouse apartment." It was a fortune by any measure, but it was not the empire. Covington took a breath. "All the rest of my estate, including my controlling shares in Sterling Global Shipping, all real estate holdings, including the Greywood estate, and the remainder of my liquid assets, valued at approximately $900 million, I leave to my son, Julian." The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Serafina's face, a moment before so poised and confident, was now a mask of frozen, uncomprehending shock. Julian, for his part, looked equally stunned, as if he had misheard. The will continued, Alistair's words a posthumous, final twist of the knife. I have come to realize in my final years, Covington read, that the hunger that drives a man to build an empire is the same hunger that will tear it apart. Serafina has my fire, but she lacks my wisdom. Julian, however, has the steady, scholarly hand of a curator, a preserver. He will protect my legacy, not consume it. It is my final wish that he leave the dusty world of academia and take his rightful place at the head of this family. It was a complete and total repudiation. Alistair had not rewarded Serafina. He had demoted her. He had given her a gilded cage, a respectable, powerless position, while handing the keys to the kingdom to the son he had spent a lifetime deriding. Serafina said nothing. She rose from the sofa with a chilling, unnatural calm, her face a blank, white canvas. "If you'll excuse me," she said, her voice a thin, brittle whisper. "I have a headache." She swept out of the room, her spine rigid, her every movement radiating a cold, concentrated fury. The days that followed were a blur of legal activity. Julian, overwhelmed but resolute, began the process of taking control of the empire he had never wanted. He was a man of integrity, and he intended to honor his father's final wish. He met with the board of directors, with financial advisors, with estate managers. He was a fast learner, and his quiet, analytical mind was surprisingly well suited to the complexities of the business. Serafina, meanwhile, retreated into the shadows of Greywood. She was a ghost in her own home, moving silently through the grand rooms, her face a mask of polite, inscrutable grief. She was gracious to her brother, offering to help with the transition, to provide him with any information he needed. Julian, a man who saw the best in people, took her offers at face value. He saw her cooperation as a sign of acceptance, of a shared, if difficult, path forward. He did not see the viper coiling in the heart of his home. The murder, when it happened, was a masterpiece of subtlety and misdirection. 2 weeks after the reading of the will, Julian was working late in the library, poring over complex shipping manifests. He was a man of simple tastes, and his only vice was a nightly cup of hot cocoa, a comforting ritual from his childhood. Serafina had insisted on preparing it for him, a small, sisterly gesture of reconciliation. "You look exhausted," she'd said, her voice a silken caress as she placed the steaming mug on the desk beside him. "Let me take care of you, dear brother." Julian had smiled, touched by her apparent kindness. He drank the cocoa, and an hour later he was dead. The housekeeper found him the next morning, slumped over his desk, his face peaceful, as if he had simply fallen asleep while working. The initial conclusion of the family doctor was a massive, unexpected stroke or aneurysm, a tragic consequence of the immense stress he had been under. It was a neat, clean, and utterly believable tragedy. Serafina's performance was breathtaking. She was the picture of the devastated, heartbroken sister, now burdened with the terrible responsibility of leading the family she had tried so hard to support. With Julian's sudden death, the Sterling Empire, by the laws of succession, passed to her. She was now the queen. The case would have been closed, the death certificate signed, and the truth buried forever, were it not for one man, Detective Miles Corbin. Corbin was a homicide detective from the state police, a man on the tail end of a long, distinguished career. He was sharp, cynical, and had a finely tuned nose for deception. The Sterling family, with its immense wealth and power, was outside his usual jurisdiction of gas station robberies and domestic disputes, but a death of this magnitude, involving this much money, automatically triggered a state-level review. Corbin arrived at Greywood 2 days after Julian's death. He was not impressed by the grandeur of the estate. He saw it for what it was, a big, old house with a lot of secrets. He met with Serafina in the library, the same room where her brother had died. She was the perfect grieving heiress, her sorrow palpable and elegant. "It's all been so sudden," she said, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "First my father and now Julian. The stress." The doctor said it was just too much for his heart. Corbin listened, his expression neutral. He asked for a timeline of Julian's last day. Serafina recounted it flawlessly. The meetings, the long hours in the library, the cup of cocoa she had made for him as a gesture of comfort. It was that last detail that snagged in Corbin's mind. It was too perfect, too poignant. It was a detail from a screenplay, not a real-life tragedy. "I'd like to see the mug," Corbin said, his request casual. Serafina's composure faltered for a fraction of a second. "The mug? I'm afraid the housekeeper washed it this morning. It's just a mug." "Of course," Corbin said. He knew that in a house like this, with a professional staff, a dirty dish wouldn't sit out all night. But he also knew that a crime scene had just been scrubbed clean. Corbin's next move was to put a hold on Julian's cremation, which Serafina had been trying to expedite, citing a wish for a swift and private family farewell. Against the protests of the Sterling family lawyers, Corbin ordered a full autopsy and toxicology screening. While he waited for the results, he began to dig. He started with the will. He met with Arthur Covington, the family lawyer, a man who seemed deeply uncomfortable and saddened by the turn of events. "The will was a complete shock to everyone," Covington admitted, polishing his spectacles nervously. Alistair had always led Serafina to believe she would be the one to take over. He changed it quite suddenly in his last month. He seemed to have had a late-life crisis of conscience, a realization that his son's temperament was better suited to preserving his legacy. "How did Serafina take the news?" Corbin asked. "With a remarkable, if chilling, amount of grace," Covington replied. "She said nothing, but the look in her eyes. It was the same look her father had when he was about to close a hostile takeover. It was the look of a predator that has been denied its kill." Days later, the toxicology report came back. It was the smoking gun Corbin had been hoping for. The medical examiner had found a massive, lethal dose of digoxin in Julian's system. Digoxin was a powerful cardiac medication, derived from the foxglove plant. In prescribed doses, it regulated an irregular heartbeat. In an overdose, it caused the heart to simply stop. It was the perfect poison to mimic a natural, catastrophic cardiac event. Corbin now had a murder. He had a prime suspect with a $900 million motive. And he had a story of a seemingly kind sister delivering a final, fatal cup of hot cocoa. But he knew, with a sinking feeling, that it wasn't enough. Serafina was insulated by a wall of money and power. He had no physical evidence, no witnesses, no way to tie her directly to the poison. He needed something more. He needed to find the flaw in her perfect, calculated plan. He had a feeling that the answer wasn't in the future she had just stolen, but in the past she had tried to control. The answer, he suspected, lay somewhere in the ink and paper of her father's last will and testament. With the confirmation of poison, Greywood transformed from a house of mourning into the gilded cage of a crime scene. Detective Corbin now had a murder, but he was facing a formidable opponent. Serafina Sterling was not a common criminal. She was intelligent, meticulous, and surrounded by a legal team that could tie up the investigation in procedural knots for years. Corbin knew that a direct assault would fail. He couldn't prove she had administered the digoxin. The mug was clean, and there was no evidence she had ever purchased or possessed the drug. He needed to attack her from a different angle. He needed to prove not just that she had the motive of inheritance, but that she had actively and criminally pursued it before the murder. His investigation shifted its focus from the poison to the paper. His first stop was back at the office of Arthur Covington, the family lawyer. The library at Covington's firm was a hushed, leather-bound sanctuary of legal history. Corbin wanted to see the will again, not just to read it, but to examine it as a physical object. "I want to know everything about the signing of this document," Corbin said, laying the will on the polished mahogany table. Who was there? What was Alistair Sterling's state of mind? Covington sighed, a deep, weary sound. It was highly unusual. Alistair summoned me to Greywood about a month before he passed. He was lucid, sharp as a tack, but different. He seemed reflective, almost melancholic. He told me he wanted to make a significant change to his will. Serafina was there, of course. She never left his side in those final months. She was his gatekeeper. Was she in the room when he dictated the changes? Corbin asked. No, Covington said, shaking his head. He insisted she wait outside. He was very firm about it. He dictated the new terms directly to me. He wanted to leave the bulk of the estate to Julian. He was quite emotional about it, actually. Said he had spent a lifetime undervaluing his son and wanted to make it right. And the signing? That happened 2 days later. I returned with the finalized document. As required by law, we needed 2 witnesses. Alistair insisted on using his private nurse, a woman named Helen, and his head of security, a man named Marcus. Serafina was present in the room during the signing, but she stood by the fireplace, silent. She watched the entire process like a hawk. Corbin examined the last page of the will. The signatures were all there. Alistair Sterling's, a spidery but firm scrawl. The nurse's, a neat, professional script. And the security chief's, a bold, confident signature. On the surface, everything was in perfect legal order. But something felt wrong. Covington's description of Alistair's emotional state, his desire to make it right with his son, seemed genuine. But Serafina's silent, watchful presence during the signing was a discordant note. Corbin decided to speak with the witnesses. He found the nurse, Helen, at her modest home in a nearby town. She was a kind, middle-aged woman who seemed genuinely saddened by the family's tragedies. She confirmed Covington's account of the signing. Mr. Sterling was very clear-headed that day, she said. He read the entire document carefully before he signed. He even made a little joke about hoping his children wouldn't squabble over his fortune. Serafina. She was very quiet. She just watched. Next, Corbin interviewed Marcus, the head of security. He was a former military man, loyal and taciturn. His account matched Helen's and Covington's perfectly. Yes, I witnessed the signing. Mr. Sterling asked me to. It all seemed perfectly normal. Everyone's story was consistent. The will appeared to be ironclad. But Corbin couldn't shake a nagging feeling. He took the will, with the permission of the probate court, and sent it to the state police's forensic document analysis unit. He asked them to run a full analysis on the paper, the ink, and the signatures. It was a long shot, a move born of desperation, but it was all he had. While he waited for the lab results, he decided to dig into Serafina's own world. If she was meticulous enough to plan a poisoning, she was meticulous enough to have a hidden life. He subpoenaed her personal financial records, her phone logs, her computer history. Her life, on the surface, was as pristine as her public persona. She managed the family foundation, attended charity events, and lived off a generous trust fund. But Chun, Corbin's young, tech-savvy partner, found something interesting buried deep in her credit card statements. For the past 6 months, she had been making regular monthly payments to a high-end, private art restoration and conservation studio in New York City. The payments were substantial, totaling over $50,000. Why would she be paying an art restorer? Chun wondered aloud. The Sterling collection is world-class. It's managed by a museum. Any conservation work would go through them, not her private account. It was another loose thread. On a hunch, Corbin paid a visit to the studio. The owner was a cagey, European man who was initially reluctant to speak, citing client confidentiality. But Corbin's badge, and a veiled threat about obstruction of a homicide investigation, loosened his tongue. Yes, Miss Sterling is a client, the man admitted. She is a woman of very specific tastes. She has been commissioning a series of historical document reproductions. What kind of documents? Corbin asked, his senses tingling. Legal documents, mostly. Old deeds, contracts. She provides us with high-resolution scans, and we reproduce them on period-appropriate paper, with specially formulated inks to match the aging. We even have artisans who are experts in recreating historical handwriting styles. We are the best in the world at what we do. Our reproductions are, to the naked eye, indistinguishable from the originals. Corbin felt a jolt of electricity. Have you recently done any work for her involving a last will and testament? The man's face went pale. I cannot discuss the specifics of my client's commissions. But his eyes told Corbin everything he needed to know. Serafina hadn't been planning to contest the will. She had been planning to replace it. The final, damning piece of the puzzle arrived in a sealed envelope from the forensics lab. The chief document examiner, a woman with a passion for the microscopic world of paper and ink, called Corbin personally. You were right to send it, Detective, she said, her voice buzzing with professional excitement. This is one of the most sophisticated forgeries I have ever seen. But it's not perfect. What did you find? Corbin asked, his heart pounding. The document is composed of 2 different pages, she explained. The first 20 pages, which detail the bequests to staff and the foundation, are genuine. The paper is the correct age, the ink is consistent with Mr. Covington's office standards, and the page numbering is sequential. But the last page, the signature page, is a forgery. How can you be sure? The paper is a near-perfect match, but under microscopic analysis, the fiber composition is slightly different. But the real giveaway is the ink. We used gas chromatography. The ink used for the main body of the will has a specific chemical signature. The ink used for Alistair Sterling's signature, and the signatures of the 2 witnesses has a different signature. It's a masterful imitation, but it's not the same batch. Furthermore, the indentations of the signatures are too perfect. There are no start and stop marks that a pen naturally makes. These signatures were traced, most likely using a light box, by an incredibly skilled hand. They were then inked over to create the final product. Corbin's mind reeled, the audacity of the plan taking his breath away. Serafina hadn't forged the entire will. That would have been too difficult. She had done something far more clever. He pieced it together. The original will, the one that left everything to Julian, had a signature page. Serafina had somehow obtained this page, or a perfect scan of it. She had then commissioned the art studio to create a new, fake will, one that left everything to her. She had them leave the final page blank. Then, she had a master forger trace the genuine signatures from the real will onto the final page of her fake will. But something had gone wrong. Alistair had changed his mind at the last minute, creating the new, genuine will that favored Julian. Serafina's fake will was now useless. So she had adapted. She had taken the forged signature page, the one with the perfect trace signatures, and simply attached it to the back of Alistair's new, genuine will, after removing the original, genuinely signed last page. She was counting on the fact that no one would ever look that closely, that no one would ever question the signatures of a document that had been witnessed by 3 reliable people. The witnesses hadn't been lying when they said they saw Alistair sign his will. They had just seen him sign a piece of paper that Serafina had later detached and destroyed, replacing it with her pre-made forgery. It was a crime of breathtaking arrogance. And it was the crack in her perfect facade that Corbin had been looking for. He now had her. The murder of her brother was the second act of her crime. The first act was the forgery of her father's will, a fraud she had been planning for months. The payments to the art studio were the receipt. The forged document was the weapon. He could now prove not just motive, but a pattern of criminal intent, a meticulous, cold-blooded plan to steal an empire, a plan for which her own brother had become mere collateral damage. The discovery of the forgery was the key that unlocked the entire conspiracy. Detective Corbin now understood that he was not dealing with a simple crime of passion, but a long con, a meticulously planned heist where the prize was $1 billion empire. The murder of Julian was not the primary goal. It was a desperate, brutal improvisation after the original plan had failed. Corbin knew that a quiet arrest would be a mistake. Serafina was a creature of image and control. He needed to confront her in a way that would strip away her layers of artifice, to force her to face the ugly, greedy truth of her actions in a setting she could not manipulate. He decided to stage the final act back in the place where the drama had begun, the great library of Greywood. He arranged a formal meeting, requesting the presence of Serafina, her legal team, and the estate lawyer, Arthur Covington. The pretext was to discuss the final disposition of Julian's assets. Serafina arrived looking every bit the queen of her newly acquired kingdom. She was dressed in a chic, black morning dress, her expression one of somber, responsible authority. She was the very picture of a woman burdened by, but rising to, her tragic destiny. Corbin did not begin with accusations. He began with a history lesson. He had brought a guest with him, the owner of the art restoration studio, a man whose initial reluctance had been overcome by a signed immunity deal. "Miss Sterling," Corbin began, his voice calm and measured, "we've been looking into your patronage of the arts. It seems you have a particular passion for historical document reproduction." Serafina's eyes narrowed, a flicker of cold fury passing through them before her mask of composure was back in place. "I have many interests, detective. I hardly see how they are relevant." "They're relevant because your interests are so specific," Corbin continued, nodding to the art restorer. The man, looking deeply uncomfortable, placed a large portfolio on the library table. He opened it to reveal several documents, recreations of old sterling shipping contracts, a 19th-century land deed. "And this?" the restorer said, his voice trembling slightly, as he produced the final item. "This is the final page of a will. The client provided us with high-resolution scans of 3 signatures and asked us to reproduce them, perfectly, on this piece of custom-milled paper." He laid the page on the table. It was a perfect, blank replica of the will's signature page, but with the traced, inked-over signatures of Alistair, the nurse, and the security chief. It was the proof of concept for her forgery. Serafina's lawyer leaped to his feet. "This is an outrage. My client is a collector. This is nothing more than a historical curiosity." Corbin ignored him, his eyes locked on Serafina. "It's a beautiful piece of work, indistinguishable from the real thing. In fact, it's so good you decided to use it. You had this page, your ace in the hole, ready to be attached to a fake will that left you everything. But your father made a last-minute change. He gave the empire to the son he had finally learned to respect. He let the words hang in the silent, cavernous room. So you had to adapt. You attended the signing of the real will, the one that disinherited you. You watched your father and the witnesses sign the last page. And then, at some point, you gained access to that document. You detached the real, genuinely signed last page, and you attached this one. Your forgery. You gambled that no one would ever look closely enough to tell the difference. This is an insane, unsubstantiated fantasy," Serafina said, her voice like ice. But there was a tremor in her hands that betrayed her fear. "Is it?" Corbin replied. He produced the forensic lab report. "Because the state's top document examiner says otherwise. She says the ink is wrong. She says the paper is wrong. She says the signatures on your father's will are nothing more than masterful, traced forgeries. You didn't inherit this empire, Miss Sterling. You tried to steal it." He paused, letting the weight of the accusation settle. "But there was still one problem, wasn't there? Your brother, Julian. He was the rightful heir. As long as he was alive, he was an obstacle. He was a quiet, decent man who would have eventually uncovered your fraud. So you eliminated the final loose end. You served him a cup of hot cocoa, laced with enough digoxin to stop his heart, and you played the part of the grieving sister." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, intense whisper. "Tell me, Serafina, when you were comforting your brother in his final moments, when you were telling him to get some rest, was that part of the performance, too? Or was that the one genuine thing you did?" For a long moment, she said nothing. She stared at the forged document on the table, the physical evidence of her greed. The mask of the grieving heiress, the powerful CEO, the sorrowful sister, it all dissolved, like wet paint. What was left was a face of pure, reptilian hatred, the face of a spoiled child who had been denied her favorite toy. She looked not at Corbin, but at the portrait of her father that hung over the massive stone fireplace. "He had no right," she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. It was mine. I earned it. I stayed here in this mausoleum. I managed his life. I was the one who was like him. Julian. Julian was weak. It was my birthright. It was a confession, not of guilt, but of entitlement. She, like her father, believed that the world and everyone in it was merely an asset to be controlled, and that any obstacle to her ambition could and should be liquidated. As Corbin's detectives moved in to arrest her, she did not struggle. She simply stood, her spine straight, a final, defiant embodiment of the sterling pride that had been her ultimate undoing. The trial was a media sensation, a lurid melodrama of old money and cold-blooded murder. The forensic evidence of the forgery was undeniable, and the payments to the art studio provided a clear, premeditated timeline of her criminal intent. The restorer testified against her, his voice a quiet nail in the coffin of her defense. Serafina Sterling was found guilty of both fraud and first-degree murder, and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. The great Sterling Empire, lacking a clear heir, was eventually broken up and sold off, its assets absorbed by rival corporations. Greywood, the stone monument to a family's ambition, was sold to a hotel consortium and turned into a luxury spa. Months after the trial, Detective Corbin stood on a hill overlooking the estate. The name Greywood had been taken down, replaced by a polished brass sign that read, "The Sterling Preserve." He thought about the immense generational effort that had gone into building the fortune, and the petty, pathetic greed that had brought it all crashing down. Serafina had killed her brother not for $900 million, but for the idea that she was entitled to it. In the end, her inheritance was not an empire of shipping lanes and real estate. It was a prison cell. Her birthright was not a throne, but a legacy of dust.